It is midnight on an empty Irish road. You hear hoofbeats, but the rider who approaches carries his own head in his hand, and when he speaks your name, you die. Welcome to Shadow Folklore. Today, the Dullahan. The mist rolls thick across the bog, transforming fence posts into shrouded sentinels and hedgerows into walls of grey nothing. You've stopped your car because the fog has grown too dense to navigate safely, and now you stand on the verge of the N71, somewhere between Bantry and Glengariff in County Cork, waiting for the weather to clear. The air tastes of peat smoke and wet stone. Behind you, the Atlantic churns invisible in the darkness, its presence announced only by the rhythmic percussion of waves against cliffs you cannot see. The wind carries a coldness that has nothing to do with temperature. It is the kind of cold that settles in your chest, that makes you aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat. The fragility of being alive and alone in a landscape that has swallowed travelers for millennia. Then you hear it, not the wind, not the sea. Hoofbeats. They echo with a clarity that seems impossible in fog this thick, each strike of hoof against asphalt ringing out with metallic precision. The rhythm is wrong, too steady, too purposeful, advancing with the mechanical certainty of something that cannot be stopped or reasoned with. You step back toward your car, the hoofbeats grow louder, and then, emerging from the wall of mist, like something surfacing from deep water, you see the shape, a massive black horse, its coat gleaming with an oily sheen that seems to drink what little light exists. On its back sits a rider, tall and draped in a long cloak that moves with a life of its own. But where the head should be, there is only empty air above the shoulders. In the rider's outstretched hand, held aloft like a lantern, is his own severed head, eyes wide and glowing with a greenish phosphorescence, mouth working soundlessly as the head surveys the road ahead. This is the Dullahan, the Headless Horseman of Ireland, and his presence on this road tonight means someone nearby will not see the morning. The Dullahan is not merely a ghost story whispered to frightened children. He occupies a central place in the cosmology of rural Ireland, a psychopomp figure whose origins stretch back through centuries of Celtic belief, to a time when Ireland's spiritual landscape was populated by beings that existed in the liminal spaces between life and death, between the mortal world and the other world. To understand the Dullahan, we must first understand the people who gave him form, and the land that shaped both the people and their fears. Ireland's geography is a study in contrasts and boundaries. The island sits at the western edge of Europe, buffeted by Atlantic weather systems that sweep in with little warning, bringing fog that can reduce visibility to arm's length in minutes, storms that turn roads into rivers, and a persistent dampness that seeps into stone and bone alike. The landscape is characterized by drumlins and eskers left by retreating glaciers, by boglands that can swallow a person whole, by rocky coastlines where the distinction between land and sea becomes negotiable during high tide. Ancient field systems still mark the countryside. Stone walls built before the Romans invaded Britain, delineating territories that no longer have names. The Irish countryside is a palimpsest of human habitation, with Neolithic passage tombs, Iron Age ring forts, medieval tower houses, and abandoned famine cottages, all occupying the same visual field, all reminding the observer that this land has been inhabited, survived upon, and died in for thousands of years. The people who developed the mythology of the Dullahan were the Irish of the Celtic period and their descendants. Communities whose worldview was fundamentally animistic and cyclical. In pre-Christian Ireland, the year was divided not merely into seasons, but into periods marked by liminal festivals, Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Loughnasad. Times when the boundary between the mortal world and the other world grew thin, when spirits could cross over, when the normal rules of existence became temporarily suspended. Death was not conceived as a final ending, but as a transition, a journey from one state of being to another. The other world, known by various names including Tifeid Arna and Feiji, the land of youth, and Magmel, the plain of honey, was not located in some distant heaven, but was understood to exist alongside the mortal world, accessible through certain hills, lakes, and coastal caves, or during certain times of year. Within this cosmology, there existed a class of beings known as the Aos Fae, or simply the Sfeid Hay, pronounced she. often anglicized as the fairies. Though this translation carries unfortunate Victorian connotations of tiny, benevolent creatures that bear no resemblance to the entities the Irish actually feared. The Esfeidhi were powerful, often capricious beings who dwelt in the otherworld, but maintained connections to specific locations in the mortal realm: ancient burial mounds, ring forts, certain hills and groves. They were to be respected, propitiated, and above all not offended. Many of the Sfeidhi were thought to be the descendants of the Tuatha Dé Fé Danann, the divine race who, according to medieval Irish pseudo-history, ruled Ireland before the arrival of the Milesians, the ancestors of the modern Irish, and subsequently retreated into the hollow hills and mounds when defeated. Survival in Ireland, particularly in the centuries before industrialization, required an intimate knowledge of the land and a respect for its dangers. Bogs could look solid but conceal pockets of water deep enough to drown a horse. Coastal paths could be swept away by rogue waves. Winter storms could trap travelers between flooded rivers and impassable mountains. The darkness was absolute in rural areas, and a person caught out after nightfall without light or landmark could easily become lost, even on familiar roads. These practical dangers merged with spiritual ones in the Irish imagination. The night belonged to forces that did not have humanity's best interests at heart, and certain roads, crossroads, and field boundaries were understood to be particularly active with otherworldly traffic. Into this context comes the Dullahan, one of the most feared entities in Irish folklore. His name derives from Dullahan or Gan Shan, literally meaning dark man or without a head. He is categorized within the Esfeidhi, but represents a particular function within that category. He is a death omen, a psychopomp, an executor of fate. When the Dullahan rides, someone is about to die. When he stops at a specific house or location and calls out a name, the person named dies immediately, no matter where they are, no matter what precautions they have taken. He does not kill out of malice or hunger like many folkloric monsters. He kills because it is time, because some cosmic ledger has decreed that a particular life has reached its appointed end. The Dullahan is in essence a personification of death's inevitability, a reminder that there are forces in the universe that cannot be bargained with, prayed away, or resisted. The Dullahan appears consistently across Irish oral tradition with remarkable uniformity in his core characteristics, though regional variations add texture and detail to the basic figure. In his most common form, he is described as a tall male figure who rides a black horse, or in some accounts, drives a black coach, Fei Spodar, the silent coach drawn by 6 black horses. He is dressed in black, often wearing a long cloak that seems to absorb light. His most striking feature, of course, is his missing head. In the majority of accounts, he carries his own severed head in his right hand, held at arm's length before him, or tucked under his arm like a grotesque lantern. The head itself is described with unsettling specificity. The skin is said to have the color and texture of moldy cheese, greenish, white and waxy. The eyes are small, black, and constantly moving, darting back and forth with an insectile alertness, capable of seeing vast distances, even in complete darkness. The mouth is frozen in a hideous grin that stretches from ear to ear, displaying rows of yellowed teeth. Some accounts describe the head as luminescent, glowing with a sickly phosphorescent light that casts no useful illumination, but merely makes the surrounding darkness seem deeper by contrast. When he rides the black horse, the animal itself is described as monstrous, larger than any natural horse, with eyes that glow red or orange like coals, and breath that emerges as jets of flame or sulphurous smoke. The horse's hooves spark when they strike stone, and it moves with supernatural speed, capable of crossing a county in minutes. The sound of its hoofbeats is said to be distinct and recognizable, carrying for miles through fog and darkness with a clarity that defies natural acoustics. When the Dullahan drives the coach, it is described as being constructed from human materials, the frame assembled from femurs and ribs, the wheels fitted with spokes of human bone, the coach lights consisting of skulls with candles mounted inside, the cover made of dried human skin or funeral shrouds stitched together. The coach moves in complete silence despite its speed, earning it the name Silent Coach. and it leaves no tracks on the ground it crosses. The Dullahan carries a whip fashioned from a human spine, which he cracks over the head of his horse or uses to lash at anyone foolish enough to watch him pass. In some versions of the legend, being struck by this whip results in instant blindness. In others, the touch of the whip marks the victim for death, branding them with an invisible sigil that guarantees they will be the Dullahan's next target. His most terrifying weapon, however, is his voice. When the Dullahan reaches his destination, be it a house, a crossroads, or simply a particular spot along a road, he stops, raises his severed head high, and calls out a name. The voice is described as deep, hollow, and carrying an echo as if it emerges from the bottom of a well or a tomb. The name is spoken once, clearly, and the person named dies in that instant, regardless of their location. They might be sleeping in a locked house miles away, or abroad in another country entirely. When the Dullahan speaks their name, their life ends. No barrier can prevent this. No distance is too great. The mechanism of death varies in accounts. Some say the victim's heart simply stops, while others describe the soul being ripped from the body to be collected by the Dullahan and transported to the other world. Accounts from different regions of Ireland add variation to these core elements. In County Sligo and parts of Connacht, the Dullahan is sometimes described as driving his coach to the house of the dying and waiting outside until the death occurs, at which point the soul enters the coach and is driven away. The living must not look out their windows during this time. Those who do may be struck blind, or may see their own face among the coach's passengers, a premonition of their own imminent death. In County Galway and County Clare, some traditions describe the Dullahan as having the ability to open gates and doors simply by pointing at them. No lock or bar can keep him out. In Munster, particularly County Kerry, the Dullahan is sometimes associated with specific family lines, appearing before the death of any member of certain old families, serving as a hereditary death omen much like the banshee, though his presence is far more threatening than the banshee's mournful wail. The Dullahan possesses certain abilities that distinguish him from other death omens and supernatural entities. Unlike ghosts, which are generally confined to specific locations, the Dullahan travels freely across the country, appearing wherever death has been appointed. Unlike the banshee, who serves primarily as a warning, and whose keen can sometimes be interpreted as a lament, the Dullahan is an active agent of death, not merely a herald. He can see enormous distances in absolute darkness, his darting eyes capable of spotting any living person within miles. Some traditions claim he can extinguish any light simply by looking at it. Candles gutter and die, fires reduce to embers, and even electric lights in more modern tellings flicker and fail when his gaze falls upon them. Water does not impede him. The coach and horse cross rivers and streams without slowing, leaving no wake or disturbance on the surface. Consecrated ground provides no sanctuary. The Dullahan has been reported crossing churchyards and passing through the shadows of church walls with impunity, suggesting he operates under an authority that predates or supersedes Christian sacred space. Yet, despite his power, the Dullahan has one notable vulnerability, described with remarkable consistency across different sources. Gold. The presence of gold causes him pain or discomfort and can drive him away, at least temporarily. This weakness is specific to gold. The traditional method of warding off the Dullahan, should one encounter him on the road, is to throw a gold coin in his direction, or to wear a gold pin or jewelry that can be shown to him. Upon seeing the gold, he will turn away, sometimes with a cry of rage or pain, and seek another route. This aversion to gold is unusual in Celtic folklore, where iron is more commonly cited as protective against supernatural beings. The specificity of gold as the Dullahan's weakness has led folklorists to suggest various interpretations. Gold's association with solar symbolism and daylight. The Dullahan being a creature of night and death. Gold's status as uncorruptible metal that resists tarnish. In opposition to the Dullahan's association with decay and death, or gold's function as a symbol of wealth and social power, the Dullahan perhaps representing the democratic nature of death, which can be temporarily delayed by wealth but never permanently avoided. The Dullahan cannot be stopped by physical barriers. Locked doors, thick walls, and defensive structures offer no protection against him. Stories tell of the Dullahan appearing inside houses without any door or window having opened, materializing in bedrooms or by sick beds, as if physical architecture were merely a suggestion rather than an obstacle. Gates swing open at his approach without being touched. Some accounts describe him passing through walls like smoke, while others suggest he simply exists in multiple locations simultaneously, his presence in the other world and the mortal world overlapping in ways that make concepts of physical barrier meaningless. To understand the origin and function of the Dullahan within Irish tradition, to the deeper strains of Celtic religion, and the evolution of belief following the Christianization of Ireland, the Dullahan is not a recent invention or a product of medieval imagination. His roots extend back to pre-Christian Celtic worship, specifically to the god Crom Dubh, also known as Crom Cruach, a deity associated with harvest, kingship, and sacrifice. Historical records and Irish medieval literature describe Crom Cruach as a powerful and demanding god who required human sacrifice, particularly during the harvest season. The technical term for such sacrifice is foundation sacrifice, or dedicatory offering, the belief that success, prosperity, and the continued favor of the divine required periodic offerings of human life. The primary site of Crom Cruach's worship was Mar Sel Feachta, the plain of prostration in County Cavan, where, according to the medieval Irish text Dinsianchas, a collection of place lore compiled in the 12th century, a gold-covered idol of the god stood surrounded by 12 stone idols covered in bronze. The text describes how the people would prostrate themselves before the idol and offer sacrifices, including in times of great need or during critical agricultural seasons. Human offerings. The arrival of Christianity in Ireland, traditionally dated to the mission of St. Patrick in the 5th century CE, involved the systematic destruction of pagan sacred sites and the suppression of associated practices. According to hagiographical accounts, St. Patrick personally destroyed the idol of Crom Cruach at Magasel Feachta around 433 CE, casting it down and breaking its power. But religious belief does not simply vanish when temples are destroyed and practices forbidden. Instead, it transforms, goes underground, mutates into new forms that can exist alongside or beneath the dominant religious structure. Many scholars of Irish folklore, including Patricia Lysart, whose 1986 study The Banshee, the Irish supernatural death messenger, provides extensive analysis of death omens in Irish tradition, and D. Faith In, author of The Sacred Isle, Belief and Religion in Pre-Christian Ireland, published in 1999, have argued that figures like the Dullahan represent the survival of pre-Christian deities in demoted form. The gods become the Sfedhe, powerful but no longer worshipped, feared but no longer propitiated with sacrifice. Their temples become fairy mounds, their festivals become dangerous nights when mortals should remain indoors, and their roles within the cosmic order become distorted through the lens of Christian moral framework. The connection between Crom Dubh and the Dullahan is strengthened by certain specific associations. Crom Dubh was linked with the harvest festival of Lugnasad, the 1st of August, and the Dullahan is said to ride most frequently during this time, and during Samhain, the 31st of October Santfar, the 1st of November, the two major liminal festivals when boundaries between worlds grow thin. Crom Dubh demanded sacrifice. The Dullahan collects souls. Crom Dubh was a god of kingship and sovereignty. The Dullahan serves an implacable cosmic law that supersedes human authority. The Dullahan's beheaded state may reference the Celtic practice of head hunting and the religious significance of the severed head in Celtic culture. Heads of enemies and important individuals were preserved and displayed, believed to contain the essence of the person and to possess protective or prophetic powers. The Dullahan carrying his own head thus represents the ultimate expression of this tradition, the self-contained death. Bringja, whose separated head grants him supernatural vision and the authority to speak the names of the doomed. There is no transformation narrative associated with the Dullahan in the way that exists for entities like the werewolf or vampire. The Dullahan is not a human who became cursed or a soul that failed to find rest. However, there are protocols and taboos associated with his appearances that reveal the cultural logic of the belief. When the Dullahan is abroad, the proper response is to stay indoors. Keep windows shuttered, avoid looking out into the night. Those who must travel should carry gold if possible, and should be prepared to throw it should they encounter the horseman. To speak his name aloud on certain nights, particularly during Samhain, is to risk drawing his attention. To mock him or to claim disbelief in his existence is considered dangerously foolish, the kind of pride that invites cosmic correction. The Irish countryside is marked by certain locations known to be favored by the Dullahan, particular crossroads, stretches of road, bridges, and field boundaries, where sightings have been repeatedly reported over generations. These places often coincide with liminal spaces in the landscape, fords where roads cross streams, boundaries between parishes, gates between townlands, crossroads that mark the junction of old territories. Crossroads, in particular, hold special significance in Irish folklore, as places where the normal rules are suspended, where the other world presses close to the mortal realm, where meetings with supernatural beings are most likely. The tradition of burying suicides at crossroads, a practice that continued in parts of Ireland into the 19th century, reflects this liminality, placing unconsecrated dead at a cosmic junction point, neither fully in the Christian community nor completely cast out. The Dullahan's relationship with the banshee is worth examining, as both are death omens within Irish tradition, but they function quite differently. The banshee from Bean Esfeidhe, woman of the Esfeidhe, is primarily a warner. She appears before the death of members of certain old Irish families, particularly those with the O or Mac prefixes, indicating Gaelic ancestry, keening and wailing to announce the approaching death. Her cry is mournful, sometimes described as beautiful in its sorrow, and she herself is often portrayed as a woman in white or grey, washing bloody clothes at a river or stream. She warns, but she does not kill. The death she announces will happen regardless of her presence. She is merely giving the family time to prepare, to call the priest, to gather for last words. The Dullahan, by contrast, is not a warner, but an executor. His appearance does not give warning. It marks the moment of death. He does not mourn, he collects, where the banshee might be understood as compassionate, giving families the gift of preparation. The Dullahan is implacable, representing death's ultimate authority and inevitability. The distinction between warning and execution reflects a deeper philosophical understanding within Irish tradition of death as a multi-stage process. The banshee belongs to the anticipatory phase, the time when death approaches but has not yet arrived, when prayers might still be said and family might still gather. The Dullahan belongs to the moment of transition itself, the instant when life ends and the soul must be conducted to its next destination. His role is not to warn but to witness, to seal, to transport. In some family traditions, it is said that the banshee keens for members of the family line, while the Dullahan may appear for anyone, regardless of ancestry or status. Death, in this formulation, is both personal and universal. The banshee provides the personal dimension, maintaining the connection between the otherworld and specific family lines, while the Dullahan represents death's universality, the fact that all souls must eventually make the crossing regardless of name or lineage. The logic of the Dullahan's power, his ability to kill simply by speaking a name, reflects a worldview in which language possesses material reality and creative force. In many traditional cultures, including Celtic Ireland, names are understood not merely as labels but as essential components of identity and being. To know someone's true name is to have power over them. To speak a name is to summon or invoke the person named. This is why, in some Irish traditions, people avoided speaking the names of the recently dead after dark, fearing it might draw the attention of the dead person's spirit or of entities that feed on death. The Dullahan speaking a name creates an instant connection between the named person and the realm of death, a connection so powerful that the person's life simply ends. The voice acts as a severing tool, cutting the ties between soul and body, between mortal world and mortal life. By the 17th century, as English colonization of Ireland intensified, and as English language records began to document Irish folk beliefs, the Dullahan entered the written record through the observations of outsiders, though often filtered through layers of misunderstanding, sensationalism, and colonial contempt. English administrators, Protestant ministers, and travelers in Ireland encountered a rural population whose beliefs they regarded as superstitious holdovers from Catholicism. Or worse, as evidence of the Irish people's fundamental backwardness and unsuitability for self-governance. The supernatural folklore of Ireland was documented, but rarely with ethnographic sensitivity or cultural respect. Instead, these beliefs became weapons in a rhetorical campaign to justify English rule and the suppression of Irish language and culture. The writings of Edmund Spenser, the English poet who served as secretary to the Lord Deputy of Ireland, and who witnessed the brutal suppression of the Desmond rebellions in Munster during the 1580s, include dismissive references to Irish beliefs in spirits and omens. In his prose work A View of the Present State of Ireland, written around 1596 but not published until 1633, Spenser describes the Irish as living in a state of barbarism, their minds clouded by superstitious practices inherited from their pre-Christian past. While he does not specifically name the Dullahan, he references the Irish belief in phantasmes and spirit visions that appear before deaths and disasters, framing these beliefs as evidence of Irish intellectual and moral inferiority. Spenser's perspective was not unusual among English colonizers. Irish folklore was treated as a curiosity at best, proof of degeneracy at worst. The systematic documentation of Irish folklore by more sympathetic observers would not begin in earnest until the 19th century, but earlier records exist in fragmentary form. The medieval Irish manuscripts preserved in monastic centers contain references to headless figures and death omens, though these references are often coded in the Latin text or appear as marginal annotations. The Acalum Nasan Feirach Colloquy of the Ancients, a 12th century text that purports to record conversations between Saint Patrick and the surviving members of the Fianna, the legendary warrior band of Irish mythology, includes passages describing encounters with supernatural beings at crossroads and references to entities that appear before deaths, though the Christian framework of the text tends to portray these beings as demons rather than as the morally ambiguous entities of pre-Christian belief. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as romantic interest in folklore antiquarianism and the supposed primitive peoples of Europe grew, collectors began traveling through rural Ireland documenting tales and beliefs. Thomas Crofton Croker, an Irish antiquarian, published Fairy Legends and Traditions of the South of Ireland in 1825, a collection that brought Irish folklore to a wider English-speaking audience. Croker's work includes accounts of death omens and supernatural horsemen, though he tends to group various entities together, and does not always distinguish clearly between the Dullahan, the banshee, and other death-associated spirits. His approach was preservationist but also romanticizing. He was collecting what he saw as the remnants of a disappearing world, but he filtered it through the sensibilities of English Gothic literature and romantic nationalism. Lady Jane Wilde, mother of Oscar Wilde, writing under the pseudonym Speranza, published Ancient Legends, Mystic Charms, and Superstitions of Ireland in 1887. Her collection includes more detailed accounts of the Dullahan, describing him as one of the most feared figures in Irish lore, and noting the belief in his imperviousness to barriers and his vulnerability only to gold. Lady Wilde's work is valuable for preserving specific variants and regional differences, though, like many collectors of her era, she occasionally embellished or dramatized the tales for literary effect. The most systematic documentation of Irish folklore came with the establishment of the Irish Folklore Commission in 1935. Later reorganized as the Department of Irish Folklore at University College Dublin in 1971. The commission employed collectors who travelled throughout Ireland conducting interviews in Irish and English, creating an archive of more than 2 million pages of material documenting beliefs, practices, tales, and customs. The school's collection, gathered between 1937 and 1939, involved schoolchildren throughout Ireland interviewing elderly members of their communities about traditional beliefs. These records include hundreds of accounts of the Dullahan, ranging from direct claimed sightings to second-hand stories, to descriptions of precautions and protective measures. The accounts show remarkable consistency in the core elements: the headless figure, the black horse or coach, the speaking of the name, the vulnerability to gold, while displaying rich variation in details and in the narrative framing of encounters. The distinction between insider and outsider perspectives on the Dullahan is crucial. For rural Irish communities, particularly those where Irish Gaelic remained the dominant language through the 19th century. The Dullahan was not a quaint folkloric artifact, but an active element of the cosmology, a real danger that required real precautions. The belief-shaped behavior. People avoided certain roads after dark, carried gold coins or pieces of gold jewelry when travel was necessary at night, closed shutters, and avoided looking out windows when unexplained hoofbeats were heard. The Dullahan was integrated into a broader understanding of the world as a place where the visible and invisible realms interpenetrated, where spiritual entities had agency and power, and where human beings needed to navigate carefully, observing protocols and taboos to minimize danger. For outsiders, particularly English-speaking Protestants and urban sophisticates, the Dullahan was something else entirely. Evidence of peasant superstition, a colorful story, a gothic thrill, or raw material for literary exploitation. This divide reflects a broader pattern in the colonial encounter between England and Ireland. Irish culture, including its folklore, was simultaneously despised as backward and mined as exotic material for consumption by English audiences. The colonizers' gaze transformed the Dullahan from a figure of genuine terror and cosmological significance within Irish tradition into a prop in Gothic horror tales, a specimen in folkloric collections, or a data point in ethnographic studies that framed Irish belief as a survival of primitive thinking that would inevitably give way to modern rationality. Washington Irving's transformation of the Dullahan into the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow represents one of the most significant examples of this appropriation and transformation. Irving, an American writer of Dutch, English descent, published The Legend of Sleepy Hollow in 1820 as part of his collection The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, Gent. The story is set in a Dutch settlement in New York's Hudson Valley around 1790 and features Ichabod Crane, a superstitious schoolmaster who encounters a headless horseman while riding home late at night. Irving's horseman is explicitly identified in the story as the ghost of a Hessian soldier who lost his head to a cannonball during the Revolutionary War, and who rides nightly in search of his lost head. Irving had deep familiarity with European folklore, including Irish traditions. He had traveled extensively in Europe, including a visit to Walter Scott in Scotland in 1817, where he was exposed to Celtic folklore and to Scott's own work collecting and adapting traditional ballads and legends. The resemblance between Irving's Headless Horseman and the Irish Dullahan is too close to be coincidental. Both are headless figures on horseback associated with night and death. Both ride with supernatural speed. Both are linked to specific locations and routes. However, Irving's adaptation fundamentally changes the nature of the entity. His horseman is a ghost seeking something his head, motivated by a specific death, the war injury, and, crucially, is revealed at the story's end to likely be a hoax, perpetrated by Brom Bones to frighten away his rival Ichabod Crane. The ambiguity of the ending, is the horseman real or fake, is part of Irving's literary strategy, but it transforms the Headless Horseman from a cosmic force into a narrative device, from an entity with religious and philosophical weight into a ghost story that may not even have a ghost. This transformation reflects the position of Irish folklore in America during the early 19th century. Irish immigration to America, which would reach massive scale during and after the Great Famine of 1845 to 1852, was already underway in Irving's time, though on a smaller scale. Irish immigrants brought their beliefs with them, including stories of the Dullahan, and these stories circulated in immigrant communities and seeped into the broader culture. However, in the American context, disconnected from the landscape and the cultural matrix that gave them meaning, the stories became increasingly folklorized, transformed into entertaining tales, rather than lived beliefs, material for literary exploitation, rather than elements of an active cosmology. The Irish diaspora's complex relationship with its own folklore is part of the Dullahan's evolution. For immigrants struggling to assimilate into American society, particularly in the face of intense anti-Irish prejudice that characterized much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the supernatural beliefs of the old country could be both a connection to home and an embarrassment, a marker of difference that signaled otherness in a society that demanded conformity. Some immigrant families preserved the stories but increasingly framed them as entertainment or family tradition, rather than as descriptions of reality. Others abandoned them entirely, embracing a rationalist worldview as part of the process of becoming American. Still others maintained the beliefs privately, while participating in mainstream American culture publicly, creating a divided consciousness in which the Dullahan and other entities remained real but unspeakable outside the family or community. The connection between Irving's Sleepy Hollow and Irish immigration is geographic as well as cultural. The Hudson Valley and neighboring areas of New York and New England received substantial Irish immigration in the early 19th century, and by the time of the Great Famine, Irish communities were well established throughout the region. The setting of Irving's tale in a Dutch community serves to distance the story from Irish origins. But the folk beliefs that inform the tale, the emphasis on crossroads, the association of the horseman with a specific bridge, liminal spaces, boundary crossings, the protective power of certain rituals, all resonate strongly with Irish, rather than Dutch or German folkloric patterns. Irving was creating an American Gothic by blending European sources, and the Dullahan provided particularly vivid material for that project. The documented history of belief in the Dullahan includes numerous accounts spanning several centuries, though the nature of the documentation changes significantly over time. The earliest verifiable references appear in Irish language manuscripts from the medieval period, though these often use circumlocutions or descriptive phrases rather than the specific term Dullahan. More detailed accounts appear in the 19th and 20th centuries, as folklorists and the Irish Folklore Commission systematically collected oral traditions. What follows are several documented cases that illustrate both the persistence of the belief and the variety of forms it takes in first-hand accounts. In October 1806, a death in County Mayo was attributed to the Dullahan's intervention by the family of the deceased, and by witnesses who claimed to have heard the coach and seen its passage. The case was documented by a Protestant minister, Reverend Caesar Otway, who recorded it in his 1841 work Sketches in Eris and Tyrawley. Otway, though skeptical of supernatural explanations, took the testimony of multiple witnesses who described hearing a coach passing on the road outside the village of Belmallet late at night during a period when no coach service operated in that remote area. The sound was described as distinctive: wheels on gravel, multiple horses, but no accompanying sounds of harness, jingling, or driver's calls. Within an hour of the coach's passage, a man named Seamus Moran, who had been in apparently good health, was found dead in his bed, his face locked in an expression that witnesses described as terror. Otway attributes the death to natural causes, likely a heart attack or stroke, and the coach sounds to auditory hallucination or misidentification of natural sounds. But he acknowledges that the timing and the community's immediate interpretation of events as the work of the Dullahan demonstrate the strength and specificity of the belief. A more detailed account comes from County Galway, recorded in the Irish Folklore Commission archive as part of the school's collection in 1938. The informant was Mary Maloney, age 72, from the townland of Kinvara, recounting an incident that occurred in her childhood around 1874. Mary described seeing the Dullahan himself while she was walking home from a neighbor's house after dark. She had stayed later than intended and was hurrying along the road when she heard hoofbeats behind her. She stepped off the road into the grass, expecting a neighbor to pass on horseback. Instead, she saw a large black horse carrying a rider whose head was missing. The head, she said, was carried in the rider's hand and was looking all around, the eyes of it moving even though the head itself was still. She had a gold wedding ring from her deceased mother on a chain around her neck, and as the rider approached, she pulled it out from under her shawl and held it up. The rider pulled the horse up short, and the head in his hand turned to look at me direct. Then he turned the horse and went off across the fields, not following the road at all, just going straight through fences and hedges as if they weren't there. Mary stated that she ran the rest of the way home, and that her family kept her indoors for a full week afterward, lighting candles at the windows and keeping all doors and gates closed. Notably, no death occurred in the family or immediate area following this encounter, which Mary attributed to the protective power of the gold ring. During the Irish Civil War 1922 to 1923, accounts of Dullahan sightings increased dramatically in rural areas, particularly in regions where violence and sudden death had become common. A documented case from March 1923 comes from County Tipperary, recorded in the records of the Irish Republican Army's 4th Tipperary Brigade. 3 IRA volunteers were traveling at night between safe houses when they heard what they described as a coach approaching at high speed. The men took cover, expecting Free State forces. Instead, they reported seeing a black coach moving down the road without lights and in complete silence, driven by a figure they could not see clearly. One of the men, Michael Brennan, fired a warning shot, but the bullet appeared to have no effect. The coach passed their position, and Brennan reported seeing skulls where the running lights should be, glowing with a sick yellowish light. The men did not attempt to stop the coach and made their way quickly to the next safe house. The following morning, they learned that 2 Free State soldiers had been killed in an ambush 15 miles away at approximately the time they had seen the coach. Brennan later wrote that they interpreted the coach as the Dullahan collecting souls from that night's violence. This account is valuable for several reasons. It comes from relatively educated men. The IRA volunteers during this period tended to be literate and politically engaged, and it demonstrates how the folklore adapted to incorporate contemporary elements, the glowing skulls as coach lamps. A case from County Donegal in August 1935 was investigated by the Irish Folklore Commission and is preserved in detailed form in their archives. A farmer named Patrick McGinley reported that on the night of the 6th of August, as he was securing his livestock before going to bed, he heard hoofbeats on the road that ran past his property. He went to the gate to see who was passing at such a late hour close to midnight. He saw a rider on a black horse, but could not make out details in the darkness. Then, he reported, the rider's head lit up with a green glow, and I could see it was not on his shoulders, but in his hand, held out before him like a lamp. McGinley said he immediately retreated into his house, locked the door, and woke his wife and children. They remained awake the rest of the night. The following morning, they learned that a neighbor, Thomas Sweeney, who lived 3 miles away, had died during the night. Sweeney had been ill with tuberculosis, but his death was unexpected at that moment. He had seemed stable earlier in the day. The Folklore Commission investigator, Seifen Fay Lee Bat, noted in his report that McGinley was regarded in the community as a reliable witness, that he was not known for superstitious beliefs or for embellishing stories, and that the timing of his sighting coinciding with Sweeney's death had strengthened belief in the Dullahan throughout the area. Fais Filiab Fayen made no determination about the reality of McGinley's experience, but documented it as a significant example of active folklore belief in mid-20th century rural Ireland. An unusual case from 1947 involves not a sighting but a sound recording. A BBC regional broadcaster in Northern Ireland, conducting interviews in County Fermanagh about local traditions, recorded an interview with an elderly woman, Bridget Maguire, who described multiple encounters with the Dullahan throughout her life. During the interview, which was conducted at Maguire's cottage, the recording equipment picked up what the engineer described as hoofbeats and the sound of wheels on gravel that lasted for approximately 30 seconds. The sounds do not appear to have been audible to the interviewer or to Maguire during the recording session. They were only noticed when the tape was reviewed later. The engineer, Christopher Hayes, noted in his report that no traffic had passed the cottage during the interview, that the road outside was a minor country road that carried little traffic at any time, and that the quality of the sound was unusual, too clear and too distinct, as if recorded in a studio rather than picked up through walls and windows. The recording still exists in the BBC archives and has been analysed by audio engineers who have not reached consensus on an explanation. Skeptics suggest the sounds may have been electromagnetic interference, or may have been present, but simply not consciously noticed by those in the room, auditory selective attention. Believers point to the recording as objective evidence of the Dullahan's presence. What is undeniable is that the recording provides a peculiar artifact of the belief tradition, a case where technology intersected with folklore in unexpected ways. More recent accounts, from the late 20th and early 21st centuries, tend to appear in different contexts. Letters to newspapers, posts on internet forums, reports to paranormal investigation groups. A 1983 case from County Kerry involved a bus driver, Michael O'Shea, who reported seeing a headless figure on horseback cross the road in front of his bus on the night of the 31st of October near the town of Tralee. O'Shea braked hard to avoid a collision, and his passengers, 3 tourists returning from a local festival, also reported seeing something large and dark cross in front of the vehicle, though their descriptions were less detailed than O'Shea's. No impact occurred, and when O'Shea got out to check the road, there was no sign of horse or rider. O'Shea reported the incident to his company, which documented it in their incident log. The case received brief attention in the Irish press, with the Kerryman newspaper publishing a short article on the 10th of November 1983, under the headline, "Bus Driver Reports Halloween Sighting." The tone of the article is skeptical but not dismissive, reflecting a cultural position in which the Dullahan is regarded as an amusing or quaint belief by urban, educated Irish people, but is still recognized as a living tradition in some rural areas. These documented cases share several common features. First, they tend to occur at night, particularly late at night or around midnight. Second, they frequently involve travel or boundary crossing. The witnesses are on roads, near crossroads, or in transitional spaces. Third, many, though not all, coincide with actual deaths, either immediately before, during, or shortly after the sighting. Fourth, witnesses consistently describe similar physical details, despite having no apparent means of coordinating their accounts. The black horse, the severed head with glowing eyes, the silence or peculiar clarity of sound, the sense of speed and unstoppability. Fifth, witnesses who successfully ward off the Dullahan with gold consistently describe him turning away or becoming agitated at the sight of the metal. From a skeptical perspective, these consistencies might be explained by cultural transmission. People see what they expect to see, shaped by stories they've heard since childhood. The coincidence with deaths might be explained by confirmation bias and selective memory. People remember the sightings that coincided with deaths and forget those that didn't. The physical descriptions might reflect common tropes in ghost stories and death omens across cultures: darkness, horses, severed heads, glowing eyes. The role of gold might function as a psychological comfort mechanism, allowing people to believe they have some control over an otherwise uncontrollable phenomenon, death itself. From a believer's perspective, the consistencies are evidence of the Dullahan's objective existence as a phenomenon, whether understood as a spiritual entity, a psychic projection, or something else that doesn't fit neatly into scientific categories. The witnesses come from different time periods, different educational backgrounds, different social classes, and different levels of religious commitment. Many describe experiences that frightened or disturbed them, that they did not seek out or welcome, and that they sometimes struggle to reconcile with their conscious belief systems. The correlation with deaths, particularly unexpected deaths, is too frequent to be coincidental. The protective power of gold has been tested empirically by generations of Irish people and found to be reliable, which from a believer's perspective constitutes a form of experimental verification. What is clear from the documented record is that the Dullahan exists as a persistent cultural phenomenon within Irish tradition, a belief that has remained relatively stable over centuries, despite dramatic changes in Irish society, economy, religion, and education. The belief has survived the transition from Irish Gaelic to English as the dominant language, has survived mass emigration and urbanization, has survived the decline of traditional Catholicism and the rise of secularism, and continues to generate new accounts and new witnesses. In the 21st century, even if at a reduced frequency compared to previous eras, the Dullahan's journey into popular culture represents a fascinating study in how folklore entities are transformed when extracted from their original cultural matrix and inserted into the machinery of commercial entertainment. This process involves both gains and losses, gains in terms of reach and visibility, as the Dullahan becomes known to global audiences who would never encounter Irish oral tradition, losses in terms of meaning and depth, as the complex figure embedded in Irish cosmology becomes a simplified monster or villain designed to deliver jump scares and visual spectacle. The first major literary transformation of the Dullahan, as discussed earlier, was Washington Irving's 1820 story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. While Irving's Headless Horseman is not explicitly identified as the Irish Dullahan, the connection is clear. and Irving's story established the template for most subsequent English language representations of Headless Horseman, a figure of terror associated with a specific location, capable of pursuing victims on horseback, but fundamentally reducible to either a ghost with a localized backstory, the Hessian soldier, or a hoax. This template would be repeated with variations across nearly 2 centuries of adaptation. The Gothic literature of the Victorian period embraced headless figures and death omens, but tended to rationalize or explain them. William Carleton, an Irish writer who published extensively in the mid-19th century, included versions of the Dullahan in his collections of Irish folk tales, but often framed them within narratives that provided naturalistic explanations or that portrayed belief in such entities as a symptom of Irish Catholic superstition, contrasted with Protestant rationality. This reflects the cultural politics of 19th century Ireland, where folklore became a battleground for competing narratives about Irish identity, British rule, and the proper relationship between tradition and modernity. The 20th century saw the Dullahan and his cousins appear across a variety of media, though often in heavily modified form. The rise of horror fiction as a distinct genre, particularly in pulp magazines, and later in horror novels, created demand for monsters with visual impact and clear threat profiles. The Headless Horseman became a stock figure, appearing in numerous short stories and novels, but increasingly divorced from specifically Irish context. Instead, Headless Horsemen appeared in American frontier settings, in generic European medieval contexts, and in contemporary horror scenarios. The entity's characteristics were standardized: headless, on horseback, usually carrying the head, capable of pursuing and killing victims. The specifically Irish elements: the connection to the Esfed, hay, the role as psychopomp, the vulnerability to gold, the function as executor of fate rather than as random killer, were frequently dropped in favor of simpler monster logic. Disney's 1949 animated adaptation of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, part of the package film The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, introduced the Headless Horseman to a massive popular audience and established a powerful visual template. Disney's horseman is a figure of pure terror, faceless and implacable, pursuing Ichabod Crane through a brilliantly animated nightmare sequence. The animation emphasizes the horseman's imposing physical presence, his jack-o'-lantern head, carved pumpkin, replacing the human head in the sequence where he throws it at Ichabod, and the wild, chaotic nature of the chase. This version eliminates even Irving's ambiguity about whether the horseman is real. In Disney's version, he is thoroughly supernatural and thoroughly evil. However, the visual power of Disney's version ensured that Headless Horseman would remain part of popular imagination, a recognizable icon of Halloween and horror. The folk horror revival of the late 20th and early 21st centuries has brought renewed attention to Celtic folklore, including the Dullahan. Films like The Wicker Man 1973, though set in Scotland and not specifically about the Dullahan, demonstrated that folk horror could be both artistically serious and commercially viable. This created space for more culturally specific and historically rooted representations of folklore entities. The Irish film industry has produced several works that engage with the Dullahan tradition more respectfully, including The Eclipse 2009, which incorporates death omens and supernatural horsemen into a contemporary Irish setting, treating them not as monsters, but as manifestations of grief and the permeable boundary between living and dead. The fantasy literature boom, particularly the rise of urban fantasy and paranormal romance as major commercial genres, has incorporated the Dullahan into multicultural supernatural worlds. In these contexts, the Dullahan often appears as one species among many, with his characteristics codified into game. Like rules, Headless rides a horse, can only be harmed by gold, serves as a death omen or soul collector. Works like Kevin Hearn's Iron Druid Chronicles, beginning 2010, and Jim Butcher's Dresden Files, beginning 2000, feature Dullahan characters or references, presenting them as beings from Irish mythology operating in contemporary America. These representations tend to preserve more of the Irish-specific elements than earlier popular culture versions, reflecting both the influence of academic folklore studies on contemporary fantasy writers and the rise of internet based access to primary source material. Writers and readers can now access Irish Folklore Commission archives, academic papers, and detailed cultural histories with relative ease, allowing for more informed, if still commercially adapted representations. The horror manga and anime tradition in Japan has produced its own version of headless figures, most notably the Dullahan character Celti Sturluson in the series Durarara. Light novels beginning 2004, anime 2010. This version makes explicit reference to the Irish Dullahan tradition and incorporates several authentic elements. The black motorcycle replaces the black horse. As a modernization of the legend, the character searches for her stolen head, and she works as a transporter, a modern interpretation of the psychopomp role. However, the character is also thoroughly Japanese in her presentation and personality, speaking through text messages on a PDA latter smartphone, expressing emotions through a helmet that displays different symbols, and participating in the social dynamics of contemporary Tokyo. This represents a form of cultural globalization, where folklore entities become raw material for new narratives that transcend their original contexts entirely, creating something genuinely hybrid. Video games have embraced the Dullahan enthusiastically, particularly in role-playing games and fantasy strategy games where diverse mythologies provide rosters of creatures and characters. The Persona series, 1996, present, which draws heavily on world mythology for its demon fae persona designs, features multiple Dullahan incarnations across different games, usually presented as relatively high-level entities with death-themed abilities. The Castlevania series, 1986, present, has featured Headless Horseman as recurring enemies, usually as mid-level bosses that players encounter in Gothic castle settings. The visual design typically emphasizes the horror elements: the severed head, often glowing or on fire, weapons like flaming swords or whips, aggressive pursuit of the player character. The vulnerability to gold is rarely incorporated in gameplay, perhaps because it would create balance issues. Gold is typically a common in-game currency, but some games substitute other mechanics that echo the original folklore, such as requiring specific blessed or holy weapons to damage the creature. The transformation of the Dullahan across these various media demonstrates several consistent patterns. First, there is a strong tendency toward visual spectacle. The headless figure is inherently striking and works well in visual media, so adaptations emphasize the dramatic potential of a rider carrying his own glowing head. Second, the cosmic or spiritual dimensions of the original tend to be simplified or eliminated. The Dullahan becomes a monster or enemy rather than a psychopomp serving a larger cosmological function. Third, the Irish cultural specificity is often erased or genericized, with the Dullahan becoming just another monster in a globalized bestiary. Fourth, when contemporary creators do attempt to engage with the Irish roots, they tend to do so in stylized or superficial ways, incorporating visual markers of Irishness, Celtic knotwork, shamrocks, bagpipes that often mix up Irish and Scottish symbols, or that reflect stereotypical rather than authentic elements of Irish culture. What is lost in these transformations is the Dullahan's role as a meditation on death's inevitability and impartiality, on the relationship between community and cosmology, on the protocols humans develop for navigating a world filled with forces beyond their control. The Dullahan in Irish tradition is not evil. He is necessary. He is not a monster to be defeated. He is a fact of existence to be acknowledged, and when possible, temporarily avoided through proper protective measures. His presence in the tradition serves both as a warning: observe the protocols, carry gold, respect the dangerous times and places, and as a comfort, death operates according to cosmic law, not randomly. There are rules. In popular culture adaptations, he becomes what horror and fantasy audiences expect: a threat to be overcome, a villain to be defeated, a creature whose purpose is to be vanquished by the hero, whose existence serves the narrative need for conflict rather than the cultural need for meaning, making in the face of mortality. Yet, despite these transformations and simplifications, the fact that the Dullahan continues to appear, continues to inspire new interpretations and adaptations, speaks to something enduring in the core image. The Headless Horseman resonates across cultures and eras because it encapsulates fundamental human experiences: the encounter with death, the terror of the uncontrollable, the presence of forces that operate by their own logic regardless of human wishes. The image of a figure that rides through the night speaking names of the doomed is, in a sense, a perfect expression of death itself. Implacable, inevitable, arbitrary from the human perspective, but following its own internal logic, capable of being seen but not stopped. The modern world, particularly in the United States and Canada, has largely dispensed with death omens and psychopomps as literal beliefs. Death in mainstream secular culture is a medical event, a biological process, perhaps a philosophical problem, but not a spiritual entity or a personified force. The dying process has been medicalized, removed from home and community into hospitals and hospices, managed by professionals, discussed in clinical language that emphasizes physiology over metaphysics. We have, in a sense, tried to strip death of its numinous quality, to reduce it to mechanism and statistics. The Dullahan reminds us that this reduction is recent, particular to certain cultural contexts, and perhaps ultimately inadequate to the human need to make meaning from mortality. There is another interpretation available, one that reconnects the Dullahan to contemporary experience without requiring literal belief in a supernatural horseman. Consider the Dullahan as a metaphor for the encounter with mortality and modernity, the moment when death's reality crashes through our elaborate systems of denial and distraction. We live in a culture that aggressively suppresses awareness of death, that sequesters dying people, that uses euphemisms and avoidances, that promises through technology and medicine to extend life indefinitely, that treats death as an aberration rather than an inevitability. Then, the Dullahan rides. A diagnosis, an accident, a sudden loss, and all our defenses collapse. The hoofbeats are the approach of the thing we have spent our lives trying not to think about. The speaking of the name is the moment when death becomes personal, not abstract. When people die becomes you will die, or someone you love has died. The Dullahan's imperviousness to barriers mirrors death's ability to ignore our protests, that it is not convenient, not fair, not time. We lock our doors against death with health insurance and medical technology, with safety regulations and risk assessments, with the assumption that careful living and proper precautions can indefinitely postpone the crossing. And death, like the Dullahan, passes through these barriers as if they don't exist. The specificity of being called by name reflects the personal, non-transferable nature of death. In the end, each of us faces it alone, and no one can die in our place. The vulnerability to gold, wealth's ability to temporarily ward off the Dullahan, can be read as a brutally honest acknowledgement that resources, privilege, and access to the best care can delay death but never permanently prevent it. The rich die too, just sometimes later, with more comfort, in better, appointed rooms. The transformation of the Dullahan in immigrant communities in North America reflects the transformation of the immigrant's relationship with death itself. In rural Ireland, death was a community event, managed at home, waked in the house, mourned collectively, according to traditions stretching back generations. Everyone in a small Irish townland knew when someone was dying and could prepare. The Dullahan, in this context, was part of a cosmology that made space for death as a transition rather than an ending, that acknowledged the permeability of the boundary between living and dead, that maintained protocols for the journey. In America, particularly as Irish immigrants urbanized and assimilated, these traditions became harder to maintain. Death became individualized, professionalized, separated from community oversight and ritual. The Dullahan could not survive this transplantation in his original form because the cultural matrix that supported him, the shared belief system, the landscape marked with meaning, the social structures that transmitted and reinforced the tradition, no longer existed in the same way. What survives is the image detached from meaning, the Headless Horseman as Halloween decoration, as stock character in horror media, as reference that people recognize without necessarily knowing the cultural depth it once possessed. This is the fate of much immigrant folklore in America. Preservation as performance, as entertainment, as ethnic signifier, but loss of lived function. The Irish-American St. Patrick's Day Parade, with its green beer and leprechaun costumes, bears about as much relationship to actual Irish culture as the Headless Horseman of popular media bears to the Dullahan of Irish tradition. What is preserved is surface. What is lost is substance. Yet perhaps there is a version of the Dullahan that could speak to contemporary experience without requiring literal belief in supernatural horsemen. What if we understood the Dullahan not as an entity to be believed in, but as a story that encodes important truths? The truth that death comes for everyone regardless of status, that it cannot be permanently avoided no matter how many doors we lock or how carefully we plan. The truth that death has its own timing and logic that may seem arbitrary to us, but that operates according to principles we don't fully understand. The truth that certain practices carrying gold, observing protocols, may provide temporary protection or comfort, but that ultimately the crossing must be made. The truth that death is not evil or malicious, but is, in a sense, just doing its job, fulfilling a necessary cosmic function. The Dullahan rides still, not on country roads in Ireland, but through hospital corridors, across highways where accidents happen, through war zones and disaster areas. He rides when the doctor says, "There is nothing more we can do." When the phone rings at 3 a.m. with news no one wants to hear. When the diagnosis comes back with words like stage 4 and weeks, not months. He rides in the moment when we confront our own mortality, or the mortality of those we love. When the abstract fact of death becomes a concrete, immediate reality. And in those moments, we learn what rural Irish people knew, that there are some forces we cannot stop or bargain with, that life operates according to rules that transcend individual will, that the only available response is acknowledgement, ritual, community, and whatever grace we can muster in the face of the inevitable. The story of the Dullahan, then, is not primarily a story about a supernatural creature. It is a story about death and how humans try to live with the knowledge of death. It is a story about the protocols we develop to navigate terrifying realities, about the comfort of believing that there are rules even for chaos, about the power of naming what frightens us. The Dullahan gave Irish people a way to think about death as something that could be temporarily avoided. Carry gold, observe the protocols, stay indoors on dangerous nights. But that would eventually arrive for everyone. This is a more honest relationship with mortality than the one offered by modern secular culture, which tends to treat death as a problem to be solved through medical advance, a failure of the body or the healthcare system, an aberration that proper intervention should be able to prevent. In losing the Dullahan, in transforming him from a cosmological figure to a Halloween decoration, we have lost not superstition but wisdom. We have lost a way of thinking about death that acknowledges its power without being paralyzed by it, that respects its authority without surrendering to despair, that maintains space for both fear and acceptance. The Irish farmers who carried gold in their pockets and locked their shutters on Samhain night were not primitive or irrational. They were engaging in a practice that acknowledged death's reality, while asserting human agency within limits. We have not become wiser by abandoning such practices. We have simply become more alienated from our own mortality, more unprepared when the Dullahan rides for us, or for those we love. So when you see the Headless Horseman decorating suburban lawns in October, riding a foam horse in a yard full of fake cobwebs and plastic skeletons, remember that he was once something else. He was once the Dullahan, a figure who embodied one of the deepest human truths, that death comes for everyone, that it speaks our name, that all we can do is live as well as we can in the time we have, observing what protocols we can, carrying what gold we possess, and hoping that when the hoofbeats sound on our particular road, we can face the rider with something approaching grace. The Dullahan rides still. He has always ridden. He will always ride. And someday, on some dark road, each of us will hear the hoofbeats approach. We'll see the glowing eyes in the severed head. We'll hear our names spoken in that hollow, echoing voice. What we do with the time before that moment, how we live knowing that the moment will come, is the question the Dullahan has been asking for 1,000 years. It is, perhaps, the only question that ultimately matters. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more folklore, myths, and mysterious creatures. See you next time.